First, the law of time. Is it possible to stop it, change it, turn it back? Has this happened before in history? Knowledge and technology of ancient civilizations, where did they go? What is meant by stop, change and reverse? Time or the law of time?
The law of time.
The law of time. That is the ratio of frequencies on which we base time.
Yes, moreover, both frequencies. There is now such an active attack on social time and on knowledge, developments, human skills and discoveries. We see an attack on education, on the fact that they are trying in every possible way to slow down human development, or even reverse it, to return us somewhere back towards the caves, well, or at least to some kind of Middle Ages. And also according to the schedule for the updating of generations, where there is also an attack in order to almost completely cease the updating of generations. With such newfangled stories in Europe, when a boy loves a boy and so on.
Well, if nothing is done, then, of course, humanity, any civilization can be rolled back into the past, after which there will remain some myths and legends on the theme that there was a golden age or something else. And these myths and legends will acquire the status of fairy tales, well, something like how we now read fairy tales, not pondering on the fact that, in general, magic is not fiction, but this is physics in which man co-participates in a certain way as an emitter of fields modulated by certain information and algorithmics. Therefore, from our point of view, these are fairy tales, and from another point of view, Emilia, from At the Pike's behest, is an outstanding biophysicist of all times and peoples who had mastered something. And in order to get people away from him, he said, "Here is a pike, go talk to her, I don't know anything." But a person really emits fields. If he emits fields, then these fields somehow impact the surrounding world. If in the surrounding world there is something to respond to these emissions, then in full accordance with the laws of physics, resonance and coherence, this will react to the emitted fields and change its quality of being. Yes, we live in a culture where we don't know how to do this, and where physics exists on its own, our life is on its own, and we somehow don't ponder about how physics manifests itself in the life of our organism and in its interaction with the external environment. If we talk about the law of time, then this term appeared as a result of the arrival at the understanding that time is not an objective category. Time, the perception of time, is always subjective. There is simply a certain process that we take in the quality of a standard, this periodic process, without even being aware of it. It is precisely due to the fact that we are not aware of the standard process that the illusion of the objectiveness of time arises. But if we look at real life, then there are only processes in life, oscillatory processes, periodic processes. We take one of them in the quality of a standard and then correlate all other processes with the duration of its periods. We don't ponder on why, when we went to kindergarten, the day was very long, And we don't ponder over why, now, we only just threw away the Christmas tree and we need to buy a new one. Simply because our psyche has been connected with other standard processes, and time is perceived differently. Further, there is such a thing, which in some sections of technology is called similarity theory. Similarity theory, what is it built on? Well, let's say that there is a ship. What is the length of the ship? Few people reflect on the fact that the length of the ship can be taken as a unit of length. And, accordingly, the time during which it passes its unit of length, that is, its own length, can be taken as a unit of time. And further look, what an interesting thing turns out. There is a real steamship in the sea. Let's say its length is 200 meters, and it passes these 200 meters in a certain number of seconds. There is a small boat, an exact copy of this steamer, which children play with in a puddle, and it travels its own length also in a certain number of seconds. If in both cases its length is a unit of measurement of distance, and the time it takes to travel its own length is a unit of measurement of time, then there is no difference between this hefty real ship and the small boat when we consider their movement on the basis of these chosen by us units of time. But if we move to a different standard, say a second, then we will immediately have this very difference. If there is no standard, then there is nothing with which to correlate. Everything happens either instantly, or it drags on endlessly, or, in general, it is somehow incomprehensible, a loss of time. The loss of time is the loss of the standard. So the term law of time, it appeared because in the life of human society, the choice of a standard, it is always subjective. Because many of our processes are built on the astronomical standard of time. The Earth has completed a cycle around the Sun, so we have a year. Further, there begin subtleties. A tropical year, an astronomical year. An astronomical year is the passage of a full cycle relative to the signs of the zodiac. And a tropical year, this is the passage of a cycle relative to the direction of the axis of the Earth. And since there is a precession of the axis of the Earth, then the tropical year is not equal to the stellar year. Further, the Japanese count their time by reign. The Meiji era, one emperor, the next emperor comes, another era. That is, these are questions of choosing a standard. Now, if you approach from these positions, then you can choose in the quality of a standard the frequency of the appearance of children in one genealogical line of any bloodline. Well, throughout history, this is probably an average of 20 to 25 years, well, perhaps not for the southern regions. And this frequency is unchanging. We can choose as a standard the time of a person's active life. It will also turn out to be 20 to 25 years, But the starting point is already different. Well, then we live in an artificial habitat. In order to use it, you need some knowledge and skills. In each historical era, we can choose the most significant knowledge and technologies for it and set their plurality, determine, and after that, we look at how this knowledge and these technologies lose their relevance. And say 90% of the identified by us knowledge loses its relevance. Well, correspondingly, a certain era has come to an end. We immediately single out new sets of knowledge and technologies that are relevant in the new era, and we also watch how they lose their relevance. And for the standard of time, in principle, one can take both this standard and another standard. One is a biological standard, the other is a culturally conditioned standard. And further we see that a change is taking place in historical development, a change in the ratio of the standard frequencies of biological time, which we determine by the lifespan of people or by the frequency of generation renewal, and the lifetime of technologies. Because if the Stone Age lasted a great length of time, now in general, there are people who don't know what an IBM card is. And in the old days, computer equipment was primarily IBM cards. And there are already people who don't know what a floppy disk is and wonder why the save program has the picture it has. They think it's a Pepsi-Cola vending machine because this picture is already associated with the Pepsi-Cola vending machine. And accordingly, the rate of updating of relevant knowledge and technologies has reached a psychologically conditioned limit. Because in many areas of activity, a person needs a lot of time to master new technologies, and then even newer technologies appear. He does not have time to master them, does not have time to change technologies in the same way as he manages to change gloves. Therefore, we have now reached a certain psychological limit, and this limit is a stress-generating factor that makes us either think or die under the impact of conditioned by stress diseases, both somatic and psychic. That is, this is the limit. And indeed, in order to ensure a comfortable life and to relieve the stress load on the population, it would be desirable to somewhat slow down the rate of updating of technology. But this requires a different way of life. A transition to a conception of quality when quality is determined by the principle a thing is unwear-outable and not a thing is the latest cry of fashion. So here are some more questions about if there is a simplification of education. Then simplification of education occurs mainly not in the direction of reducing the information that a student must master at school, because those who are parents, grandparents, they know that in the aspect of factology, the program of the modern school for children is generally unhandleable, to say nothing of the fact that it does not provide the interconnections of different facts. Therefore, the reform of the system of education is wrong, because it has changed the school in such a way that the school kills in children the skills to sense life and to think. And this is expressed not only in the fact that first-year students are not able to master the programs that their parents studied, but this is expressed in everyday trifles, in conflictedness in society, in transport, in the abominable style of driving cars on the roads. This is the result of the fact that people do not feel situations, are not able to adequately comprehend these situations.
И не в состоянии адекватно их осмыслить, эти ситуации.
Therefore, to say that in this way it will be possible to change the ratio of standard frequencies and go into the past will not work, because there are, after all, a certain number of people who think, feel. They are able to master knowledge and skills. And the rest who are not able, well, in general, their life prospects are difficult. Because if a person can only choose these or those items on the gadget menu, then there will be big problems.
Дальше будут большие проблемы.
Because the inability to feel situations, the non-correspondence between the gadget menu and this very situation, it dooms to big troubles, especially to the measure of growth of the energy supply capacity of this individual, who is given the opportunity to choose these or those items on the menu. Therefore, it will not work to turn back. But it can be brought to collapse, because if inadequate people begin to govern equipment, if they are not able to ensure the serviceability and reliability of this equipment, then, to the measure of the growth of the energy supply capacity of civilization, this can really end in such a collapse that Chernobyl will seem like nothing more than a box of matches burst into flames. And that's it. And now, the collapse of the technosphere, the collapse of culture, is immediately the fall of civilization somewhere into the past, because let's just turn to the experience of our history. As of 1913, Russia was certainly a technically backward power. The production of aircraft engines was at zero. The country was not able to build dreadnought-class warships from start to finish. There was no technology, no equipment, no cadres. Nevertheless, Russian industry was at the level of second-rate states. There was a revolution, civil war, devastation. And it took 10 to 15 years to reach the level of 1913. And, in general, the Soviet Union did not rise to the level of an independently developing state even by 1953. Because if we are to speak in essence, then, until the end of 1953, we lived in a mode of catch-up modernization. Much of what was produced in the USSR was produced several years after the corresponding analogues appeared somewhere in the West, primarily in the States or in Germany. And if people do not know how to sense and how to think, and the collapse of the technosphere occurs, then this is an even more severe rollback somewhere into ancient times. And, accordingly, if we talk about what will happen, then the instincts of herd-pack behavior will work further, an intrasocial hierarchy will line up, and it will end up with something like feudalism with the remnants of the technosphere of the 21st century. This technosphere will gradually degrade because the head of the herd pack is not necessarily the smartest one, who will understand what is happening and will take care that education develops first of all, and then everything else. And so, look, if we turn to our history, this notorious decree on Cook's children, it factually became the main factor that led to the revolution, because the main internal reason for the collapse of the empire was that there was no one to adequately govern. And even a lone genius like Mendeleev and others there, they could not do anything here, because everything is a product of collective labor, and the highest professionalism should be at all levels, from an auxiliary worker who brings nuts and screws to those who engage in fundamental science. If this is not the case, then technical backwardness, as a result, the inability to ensure the defense capability of the state, and then nothing good. Therefore, it will not work to carefully change the ratio of standard frequencies so that we return, for example, to the middle of the 20th century in terms of their ratio when they equalized. But to bring down civilization is much simpler and easier than many people think. Now, the knowledge of the technologies of ancient civilizations, where did it go? Well, by strength of mass degradation, the bulk of the population was unable to carry them. Some carriers of esoteric subcultures have preserved something. If we turn again to history, then in Germany, Ahnenerbe, legacy of the ancestors. The mission of this organization was to get to the bottom of what the ancients possessed, how to adapt it to the needs of the Third Reich. Well, it is clear that they did not seek to share this information with everyone around them. But also, one should not think that Ahnenerbe successfully disappeared along with the defeat of the Third Reich. Because, if correlated with the hierarchy of generalized means of governance, the Ahnenerbe worked at the level of the third to first priorities. That is, scientific theories, the informational algorithmic component of history, the methodology of cognition and creativity, plus any alternative physics. And do not think that these guys just disappeared along with the Third Reich, along with all their knowledge that they had accumulated. Because if you take a closer look at the history of the development of science in the post-World War II era, you get the impression that in global civilization there were two scientific subcultures: officialdom, which lies under the academies of sciences, and academies of sciences. These are not at all organizations that are engaged in the development of science. The main mission of the Academy of Sciences is to fight against so-called pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is not nonsense, more precisely, not only nonsense. But any scientific knowledge that does not fit into the conception that is scientifically methodologically ensured by scientific officialdom. Therefore, in scientific officialdom, hardly ungoverned, but there arose the practice of evaluating scientific achievements by the number of publications and the number of citations. Where does this really lead? So, Mendeleev gave birth to the epochal periodic law and tried to run for the Academy of Sciences. Academicians in those days were not the most ignorant people. They did not appreciate the periodic law and everything else that Mendeleev did. They considered that this was not enough to be an academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And Mendeleev was left without an academic title. That is, if we talk about truly breakthrough epochal achievements in science, then when they appear they can be appreciated by, well, several dozen people in the world who work in the same field and have advanced quite far. Accordingly, what citation indexes will there be? None. Close to zero. About 10 years after the epochal discovery has appeared, there will be people who will understand it and ponder on the practical application of this. And they will begin to develop this epochal discovery in an applied aspect, and there will be more or less extensive literature on the theme of what it is and what to do with it. Then, after some time has passed, other people will appear who will start writing textbooks on this theme. And then, when a certain generation of professionals grows up on the basis of these textbooks, they will enter the citation index rating system. And in order to win the capitalist competition by the name of effective contract, they organize carousels. Petya quotes Vasya, Vasya quotes Masha, Masha quotes Petya and Vasya, Petya at the next stage quotes Masha, and, as a result, the highest citation indices. It is along this path that the officialdom of science has been developing since about the mid-60s. And in order to understand what is really happening, one needs to delve into the essence of scientific theories, correlate them with life, and think about what actual practical tasks can be solved on the basis of these theories. Well, you yourselves understand that the average bureaucrat, or rather the bulk of the bureaucrats who are engaged in the evaluation of scientific activity, they are stupid in the intellectual regard. They have narrow horizons, and the only thing that they can do is look at the form number 16, list of publications of the author. Look at the citation indices and say, oh, this is a great scientist. Although in reality, if you look at what is written there, maybe even for many decades, nothing new, simply ping-pong from quotations, synonymous reworkings of what was written by others, and it seems that there is science. That is, science becomes fruitless or narrowly focused in the aspect of its scientific officialdom. But what happens in the aspect outside of officialdom? Outside of officialdom, very interesting things happened. For example, somewhere in the 50s, CIA comrades asked some mathematicians not to publish purely abstract theoretical works in the field of probability theory and mathematical statistics in the open press. Why? Because the approach that these mathematicians set out made it possible to significantly reduce the amount of calculations, and in the 60s, at the end of the 50s, in general, this year, it would be considered as a miracle of technology, and the computer, which with all the equipment would not fit into this room, was weaker than a modern laptop. And then this abstractionism, which made it possible to drastically reduce the volume of calculations by orders of magnitude, was really kept secret. The comrades who worked in this direction received good fees for silence and for their work. Those who did not possess this abstractionism, they were forced to spend a lot of computer time on colossal calculations, although the other side, without wasting computer time in such a volume, could solve the same problems much faster. But here, too, there is a question. In order to make these proposals to the mathematicians, someone had to have read some of their first works, in which there were hints, and evaluate the content of these works and the prospects, not at all on the basis of the citation index, but on the basis of what precisely these mathematicians wrote, how to use it, and what it gives. And this is one of the rare examples of such a kind, when, in general, a parallelly existing unofficial science crawled out to the surface. And apparently such things, they took place not only in the United States, but also in the Soviet Union, in other states, and again, to all appearances, this science, it was, let's say, cosmopolitan, not official science. And it is hardly possible to say that it has now disappeared somewhere. If it did not disappear anywhere after the end of the Second World War, then there are grounds to believe that after the Second World War, nothing happened in society that could have made it disappear somewhere.
And on the basis of what institutions?
If there were institutions, it would be official.
Well, even if informal, but still, some institutions...
Well, each industry has its own. Well, hang a sign, make a special laboratory there.
I don't mean in this regard. I mean in relation to the fact that some structures, after all, existed.
Well, some structures existed. We should never forget that all structures are permeated with some, in essence, mafia groupings. Systems of any doings-related communication of people, in which a dynamic redistribution of powers, duties, and controlled resources is carried out. That is, in formal networks, many activities are not documented, or the texts are of a more or less allegorical character. Again, about reading texts, it is conditioned by the principle, he who knows, he will understand, and he who does not know, these are his problems.
Ну а для того, чтобы понимать
But in order to understand some things,
требуются
basic knowledge is required for this.
базовые знания для этого. Если этих
If this
базовых
basic knowledge
знаний
is
нет,
not there,
то возникает
then a worldview abyss arises.
И тот, кто хотел
And
бы
the one who would like to,
такие
he does
вопросы
not know
задать,
what questions to
тот,
ask,
кто может
and the
дать
one who
знания,
can give
он
knowledge,
должен
he must descend to the level of this, tell him, Vasya, you are wrong, the original paradigm in general is such and such, it opens up such and such possibilities.
какие-то возможности. Но
But
если стоит
if the task
задача,
is
чтобы
that the officialdom of science would degrade,
демонтировал, то
then
кто-то
someone
проводит
also conducts casting outside the officialdom.
Причем кастинг надо проводить
Moreover, the
не тогда,
casting
когда
should not be
кто-то
carried
чего-то
out
уже наворотил.
when someone has already done
А
something,
кастинг надо
but the
проводить
casting should be
необходимо,
carried out
когда
at the stage when a
человек
person is
что-то
studying
изучает,
something,
получает
getting a
высшее
higher
образование,
education.
его
They
оценивают
evaluate him
как
as
умного,
intelligent
делают
and make an offer
предложение,
with
с
which he
которым он
agrees.
соглашается. Одно из
One of the
условий
terms of the
соглашения
agreements
не болтать.
is not to blabber.
Поэтому что, где, как
Therefore,
происходит,
what, where, how is
в
happening.
параллельном,
This is in parallel with scientific officialdom.
это отдельная
This is a
тема.
separate theme, and,
И,
in
в
general,
общем-то,
it is not
она
relevant
не
for the vast
актуальна
majority
для
of laymen.
подавляющего большинства жителей, и тем более
Moreover,
она не
for the
существует
vast
для
majority of
подавляющего
bureaucrats,
большинства
it does not
демократов.
exist.
Поэтому вопрос
Therefore,
о том,
the
куда
question of where the
деваются
knowledge
знания
and
и
technologies of
технологии
ancient
будущей
civilizations have
цивилизации,
gone is a multi-layered question.
многослойный. Для
For
кого-то
some, they have
это
gone into fairy tales and fantasy.
фэнтези, для кого-то
For some,
сказки
fairy
и
tales and
фэнтези это
fantasy are
выдумка,
fiction.
а для
For some,
кого-то
it is, after all, a reality,
это
the specifics of use of which is conditioned by the historical, political circumstances
специфика,
that have taken shape.
пользования которой, обусловлена теми историко-политическими обстоятельствами, которые сложились.
Is it possible to say that education in Russia is still in demand in the pursuit of science, of discoveries? If you look at the same decree on the cook's children, that it did not allow that Russia would slowly disappear, float away, so to speak, quietly in such a way that it would fall, degrade, dissolve, so that there would no longer be such a state, but it would lead precisely to revolutionary events, to rethinking and to a new breakthrough in science.
В общем, это были побочные эффекты.
In general, these were side effects of the politics pursued by Tsarism.
Это скорее
It is
политика,
rather
которую
politics pursued by the
проводился
Almighty in
режим
Russia.
And one more clarifying question. So it is clear with the rollback. There will either be some sort of new Middle Ages in quotation marks, or something even worse. And what could be an alternative? And was there any system in the past on the basis of which perhaps an alternative could be formed?
Any alternatives, they are the product of disagreement. The classic phrase from the famous movie, consent is the product of non-resistance, or how does it go?
From what movie?
12 chairs.
And in what episode? In what context? In what situation? Ah, well, the meaning is clear.
This is before the phrase "in the evening money, in the morning chairs," somewhere in there.
That is, the law of time itself is such an instrument that opens up the possibilities that are defined for us at the given moment. And on the other hand,
In general, in any case, if you go this way according to the entire function of governance, then disagreement with what is happening, it either kills or obliges you to manifest creative potential and generate some processes that will change the quality of being of what is. Further, there is always some kind of competition, because, after all, those who govern global politics, they pursue their own objectives. They have their own network, they have a powerful anonymizer of activity. This is culture. Well, it really is an anonymizer. We grow up in a culture without thinking about where, what, and how it came from, and for what objectives. Yes, something is accidental, something in the flow of activity of the main statistical mass, which is not particularly involved in anything, and someone thinks about the long-term prospects, expresses some idea, and finds a way to plant them, these ideas. Then a generation grows up on these ideas, and a generation on the basis of these ideas is self-governed, proceeding from the prejudices. We are so smart, we ourselves, I don't obey anyone, I'm on my own. Yes, your own. What schools did you go to? What textbooks have you read? Now read this and think about what's best. And if this other one is not brought to them, then it seems that I know everything, I can do everything. And what this "I know everything, I can do everything" is, where it came from, and what objectives it's tailored towards, few people ponder on this.
well, in general, an idea is needed, as I understand it.
Well, in general, an idea is needed. And besides the idea, people are needed who will develop and promote this idea. Because the idea, actually it was expressed long ago. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. And if we look at the fact that these words were spoken 2,000 years ago, in the official chronology, about 1,000 years in all alternative chronologies, then where is the pressing directed at this? Yes, there have been single followers, they tried to get rid of them. But the bulk lived in the belief that the idea of the kingdom of God on earth is a heresy. But after the second coming, when Jesus comes and puts things in order, there will be a terrible judgment. Then yes, the kingdom of God on earth.
There is one more problem in this phrase. It is the absence of will, because the word will is still present there.
Well, in the phrase this word is absent, but pressings, they presuppose will.
When it comes to will, it is a sad situation in our society.
Yes, not only with will, but also with cowardice, things are going very well with us.
Yes, the opposite going very well.
A lot of cowardice.
This is exactly what culture works for, as it were by itself.
Yes, law enforcement practice. Because there can be no excess of the necessary self-defense. So it can't be. As it happened, so it happened. Whoever attacked is to blame, no matter what happened to him. It was he who sowed it.
Да,
But
но
the law enforcement
правоохранительная
practice, it is such that it prohibits.
Нельзя.
Yes, there are a lot of applied aspects.
Вот. И культ
And the cultivation of cowardice.
ну, это
Well,
один из
this is one of the elements of the dominant culture in Russia for probably several
на
centuries.
протяжении, наверное, нескольких столетий. Потому что если
Because if we turn to our
обращаться к
history,
нашей истории,
then
то для
for the success of Russia,
России
one
требуется
award is
один
required:
орден. За
for steadfastness in the face of foolish superiors.
одуревшего начальства. Но
But
кто
who will
будет
nominate?
представлять,
Who will
кто
do the
будет
awarding?
награждать? Но это
But this
главная
is the main
проблема
problem
на
for many
протяжении
centuries.
многих веков.
For non-steadfastness in the face of a foolish superior.
Одуревшего начальства.
When cadre politics is built on the fact that preference is given to bootlickers, not professionals,
отдается угодникам, а не
and not those who are able to
профессионалам,
think
а не тем, кто
independently.
способен самостоятельно мыслить. В итоге
As a result, professionals and those who are able to think independently find themselves in opposition.
когда численность оппозиции
When the number of opposition becomes large enough,
большой,
the opposition becomes the power.
становится властью. А дальше
And then the
вопрос,
question is whether it degrades or not.
Ну, то есть такие тоже периодические.
Ну, в общем, это циклический.
Well, in general,
причем
this
они
happens
у нас
cyclically, and these cycles are not
не
evolutionary,
эволюционные, а через
but through points of catastrophes, because
катастрофу. Потому что
Were there no alternatives, or were there?
ну,
well, what
какие
alternatives?
Well, let's say along a spiral of
В
development.
России нет,
There are not such alternatives in Russia,
потому что мы живем
because we live in a
в цикле от
cyclics,
катастрофы
from
до
catastrophe to catastrophe.
Полный
The
цикл
full cycle of
русской
Russian
истории
history
включает в
includes
себя
two
две фазы.
phases.
Начало
The
это
beginning
завершение
is the end of a
катастрофы.
catastrophe,
Далее
then there
идет
is an
попытка
attempt to build an
построения
all-people
общенародного
state.
государства.
At the end of this first phase, there appears an elite, which does not need an all-people state. It arranges a state coup d'etat, generates an elitarian corporative state power that pushes the people around as it wants. But due to the fact that it gives preference in cadre politics to its own, and not to professionals, the elitarian corporative statehood leads the country to the next catastrophe. So look, catastrophe, the invasion of Batukan. Everything is in ruins. About 1,000-odd cities that existed before the invasion of Batukan were not restored. Some new cities appeared. About 1,000 cities, in the understanding that was in the 13th century, were not restored. The gathering of Moscow begins. Daniil of Moscow, father of Ivan Kalita, laid the foundation. There is a process up to the time of Ivan the Terrible. In general, there turns out a certain all-people state, in which everyone should work for the blago of the state, and the state should take care of everyone. Because there were in general no people who were not assigned any duties. Everyone had to toil, starting from the Tsar and ending with the very last peasant. everyone had to toil in their own way. A social association of labor was formed. But there was an elite who wanted it to be like it was in Poland. We twist the Tsar as we want. As a result, time of troubles, and there is an elitarian corporative state power, the Romanov dynasty. Its only indisputable achievement is serfdom, as a way to enslave the rest of the people. The cadre politics, well, it was such that shortly before the revolution, Witte wrote that the Russian nobility is a bunch of degenerates. Well, the collapse of the empire is natural.
The second cycle started, roughly speaking, right?
The cycle ended from a catastrophe to a catastrophe. Further, Soviet power, an attempt to build an all-people state. Somewhere in the late 30s, early 50s, an elite was formed that did not need an all-people state. The construction of an elitarian corporative state begins. Again, preference is given to relatives and close ones, all according to Griboyedov. It is natural that for my relatives I should put in a word. The son of Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Trade. They award him with an order, and the central television broadcasts. Leonid Ilyich hangs the order on his chest, and he says, "Thank you, Dad."
Well, of course, I didn't personally see it, but you were a living witness to that.
Yes, I saw. Thank you, Dad. Here we go. Well, and further the realization of the anecdote. A grandson asks his grandfather, the general, "Can I become general?" "You can." "And marshal?" No, you can't be a marshal." "Why?" And the marshal has his own grandson. This principle works. Then there is a state coup d'etat, the completion, because the state coup d'etat began in the year 1953 and ended with the juridical establishment of capitalism in 1993. What further? And further, in general, we see constant non-professionalism and incompetence of state power. Yes, there are some individual achievements that were obtained who knows how, contrary to the current legislation. Because if the entire economy works in accordance with what is prescribed by law, then neither the modernization of the Tu-22M3 is possible, nor the hypersonic weapon is possible. A lot of other things are not possible. But when it comes to mass production, so the IL-112V, it died. Plane crash. You see, the IL-112V is an aircraft, well, factually, it is crap. There are many such aircraft in the world. An ordinary serial transporter with a carrying capacity of about 5 tons. This is not something breakthrough and transcendent like the Tu-96 in 1953 or Myasishev's Bison at about the same time. These were breakthrough aircraft that, in general, determined the face of aviation for several decades. But they were created and brought to completion for several years. And whether the IL-112V will be brought to completion in at least 20 years, it has been developed since 2003. This is an open question. Because the system of education does not train professionals. And if we look at the heads of those enterprises that should ensure scientific, technological progress, then there is a great slew of jurists and financiers and all the rest. For the most part, jurists and financiers cannot pursue a scientific technical policy. That is, they cannot delve into the essence of the ideas that geniuses generate, see the prospects for the development of these ideas, and, accordingly, organize work in order that these ideas be incarnated into reality. Well, again, if we talk about what is happening in the country, then here is the Duma. We now have the 8th convocation. There are 450 people there. Many sit there not for the first time, and will continue to sit. And then the question arises, how long does it take for the smartest United Russia Party member to understand that the primary generator of inflation is the loan interest rate? How long does it take the smartest United Russia Party member to develop a set of measures in which the credit financial system of the country would work without interests on loans? How long does it take for the smartest United Russia Party member to convince the faction that has the constitutional majority to take action for the implementation of these ideas?
This is the case if they are interested in the development of the state.
Well, they say interested. Let's believe that they are interested. But then the question arises, how long does it take? In reality, it takes about 10 minutes to understand that interest on loans is the primary generator of inflation. 10 minutes. It takes 5 minutes to draw a scheme of monetary circulation in the state. That is, the central bank, industries, the state apparatus, the population divided into children and adults who work and pensioners. Connect all this with arrows of financial flows, and after that, recall. If I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the 8th grade of Soviet school, there were Kirchhoff's rules in the course of physics, the calculation of electrical networks. Kirchhoff's rules are a conservation law for transfer processes in networks. It also takes 5 minutes to recall Kirchhoff's rules and, on their basis, to analyze money circulation in the presence of loan interest and in its absence. 10, maximum 15 minutes if you use the knowledge given by the Soviet school. And for them, the origin of inflation is an enigma. Well, okay, for them it's an enigma. There are more important things to do. Books have been written. Moreover, we were not the first to write that interest on loans is very harmful. What is more, Elvira Sahibzadovna Nabiulina, as a Tatar, one would think would at least have heard something about the Quran. There it is directly said that it's a sin, usury. But she is our main old moneylender, and she also does not give a hoot about anything. And to read a thick book, and especially if it contains mathematical formulas, for the overwhelming majority of deputies of the State Duma and members of the government, is an unbearable for the intellect task. Well, what prospects are they preparing?
перспективы они готовят.
That is, everything is in such a way that
Обстоит таким образом, что
we are living
мы
in the
живем
second
во
phase of the
второй
cycle.
фазе цикла. И
The only thing
единственное,
that can improve the
что
future,
может улучшить будущее,
this is if now a social
если
group is
сейчас
formed, an
формируется
analog of the Bolsheviks,
социальная группа, аналог
not in the
большевиков,
sense of going to the barricades and so on,
на баррикады и так далее.
In terms of worldview,
Люди, вооруженные
and people armed with knowledge
знаниями,
that
которые
allow them to
позволяют
solve the
решать
problems of the
проблемы
country.
страны. И люди,
People armed with
вооруженные
skills,
навыками, в том числе и навыками
including the skills to use
пользования
biophysics,
биофизикой. Пример чего
an
все
example of
видели
which everyone saw in the movie The
в
Matrix,
«Матрице», когда Пифи
when the oracle from the kitchen, baking cookies, ruled everything she wanted.
А вот вопрос тогда,
but then the question is,
откуда эти
where did these Bolsheviks come from in 1917 with this knowledge?
их знаниями?
Ну, у них были папы.
Well, they
мамы,
had moms and dads. Let's begin with that.
А вот откуда и как пришли их души,
But from where and how their souls
это
came,
вопросы ко
these are
Всевышнему.
questions to the Almighty. But the
Но
fact that
то,
they
что они
came,
пришли, они фактически
they
вытащили
factually pulled Russia
Россию
out
из
of the
той
catastrophe
катастрофы,
to which
которую
Tsarism had led
привел
it,
царизм, и усугублению
and
этой
from the aggravation of
катастрофы
this catastrophe by the creators and leaders of the February Revolution.
творцами и лидерами февральской революции. Потому
Because
что
if we
если
talk about the
говорить о
February
февральской
Revolution,
революции, то
then the ambassadors of the allies of the Russian
союзников
Empire,
Российской империи, Франции и Англии,
France, England, oversaw the
формировали
opposition,
оппозицию,
and as a result, what
и
happened
в
happened.
результате произошло то, что произошло. Николай II, по всей
Nikolai
видимости,
II,
знал
to
об
all
этом,
appearances,
но
knew
не
about this,
посчитал
but did
возможным
not consider it possible
заключить
to conclude a
сепаратный
separate
мир с
peace with
Германией,
Germany,
обвинив
accusing the allies of
союзников
anti-government
в
activities in Russia.
антиправительственной деятельности в России. Ну, дальше возникает
Well, further the
вопрос, а
question
что было,
arises,
если белые
what would have
победили
happened
бы
if
в
the whites had won the
гражданской
Civil
войне?
War?
Ну, первый же
But the
встречный
very
вопрос,
first
а
counter
чем же
question,
они рассчитывали
how would they pay back
за
for military technical assistance to them
военно-техническую помощь
from the
со
part of the
стороны
interventionists,
интервентов?
the Entente?
Антанты.
With what?
Землей.
With land.
Природными
Natural
ресурсами,
resources
трудовыми
and labor
ресурсами
resources of Russia.
России. На кого бы всё
Who
это
would this whole
дело
thing have worked for?
на Британию,
Britain, the United
Соединенные
States,
Штаты,
Japan.
Японию? Что
What
дальше?
further?
А дальше, в общем,
And further, in
получается
general,
так,
it
что
turns out that Russia
Россия
would have
была
been about the same
примерно
colony
колония,
as
как
India,
Индия, но в
but
другом
in a different
юридическом
juridical
формате.
form.
К середине 20
By the middle of the
века
20th
она
century,
под этой властью
under such a
могла
rule,
бы
it could not have
стать
become the number two
державой номер
superpower
два, как
that it
это
became
было
under the
под
rule of the
властью
Bolsheviks,
большевиков,
who
которым
were
еще
still
мешали
hindered by the
троцкисты,
Trotskyists, with whom the Bolsheviks
с
could
которыми
not, in a timely
большевики
manner,
не смогли
disengage
вовремя
and neutralize
размежеваться
them in
и
one way or the other.
нейтрализовать их тем или иным способом.
Moreover,
Причем, если
if we talk
говорить
about
об
history,
истории, то
then history has shown what could have happened if the bourgeoisie, the liberal bourgeoisie, had won.
буржуины, либерал-буржуины. Вот смотрите,
Look at Poland.
Польша в условиях
Poland, in the
российской
conditions of the Russian
империи
Empire,
наиболее
is one of its
развитой
most developed
провинции
provinces in
в
scientific,
научно-техническом и культурном
technical, and
отношении.
cultural terms.
Ну, поляки молодцы,
Well,
трудяги,
good on the Poles.
поэтому
Hard
Польша
workers,
развита.
therefore Poland is developed.
Вот Польша стала
So,
самостоятельной
Poland became an
державой
independent
после
power
Первой мировой
after the
войны.
First World War.
Да,
Yes,
капало там
part of the
советской
territory was
России
grabbed from Soviet
часть
Russia
территории
thanks to
благодаря
Comrade
товарищу
Tukhachevsky.
Тухачевскому. В общем-то,
In general, Pilsudski recognized his colossal merit in the fact that the Red Army was defeated on the outskirts of Warsaw.
на подступах к Варшаве.
This is the merit, first of all, of Tukhachevsky. Well, what further? Further, the year 1939, the Reich in 2 weeks turned Poland into rubble. Why? Because there is nothing of its own. And, therefore, industry does not allow the creation of such weapons that would be evaluated by the Reich as unacceptable, and therefore the Reich would be forced to look for some other ways. By the 1940s, the Baltic states had reduced the number of industrial enterprises in Estonia by 1/3 compared to imperial times. And at about the same time, there arose the saying, Estonians' homeland is Estonia, their graveyard is the whole world. That is, everyone who could scarper from this Baltic, they scarpered to some other places. And in 1940, precisely thanks to the fact that the quality of life in the USSR was much higher than there, the Baltic states, its ruling elite, were forced to enter the USSR by pressure from below. Well, then the Soviet Union collapsed. We do not see the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian economic miracle. That is, history has shown the correctness of the Bolsheviks, both on the examples of what was done in the 1920s, 1940s, and on the example of what happened after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Therefore, in general, the task is to form a social stratum that will have the knowledge and practical skills in order to take the country out of the catastrophe that the clans of the post-Soviet elite are preparing by strength of the peculiarities of the cadre policy. It cannot be said that they are evil intended there, but they are professionally inconsistent, and they are not capable of steadfastness in the face of foolish superiors.
How did they manage to stay in the elite?
Well, how? They rolled over on their heads and sometimes over corpses. According to the laws of the monkey pack, an intrasocial hierarchy is formed if the types of the psyche in the bulk of the population are non-human. Everything is under the power of instincts. The instincts of herd pack behavior work. They build a hierarchy.
But the phenomenon of Bolshevism itself, there is an opinion that it is the successor of old believingness. Can I say that, or is it after all not quite right?
This is, shall we say, completely untrue, because Bolshevism, as a social phenomenon, existed long before the word Bolshevism appeared. Because the essence of Bolshevism is work for the development of society, that is, work in the interests of the majority, even in situations where the majority is intoxicated and does not understand its own interests. Therefore, Bolshevism, in this sense, it existed before Marxism in the form of certain movements in the Old Believers. But this is not all Old Believers. Before the Old Believers, it also existed. Before Nikon and the Church Schism, Bolshevism also existed precisely in this very sense. Work, according to Sovest, for the development of society.
Поэтому
Therefore, in the old believers of Bolshevism, it was expressed in the fact that, in general, a number of outstanding businessmen, entrepreneurs, old believers, they created the most powerful enterprises. But the cadres at these enterprises did not drag out a beggarly existence.
They didn't.
They did not drag out a beggarly existence. More or less normal living conditions were provided for the families of workers. They were provided with whichever quality of education for the children of these workers, although the rest of the industry in Russia factually worked well in the mode, "Why lament? Women will give birth to more." The average life expectancy in the Russian Empire is at the level of 40 years. Where does this come from? Well, firstly, high infant mortality, half of those born died before the age of 5, and generally wild working conditions at the majority of industrial enterprises also contributed to mortality. Work to the point of wear and tear. There were enterprises where people burned out, even in 5 years. Well, the production of paints, red lead, for example, is very good for health, right? Well, there we have St. Isaac's Cathedral. Approximately 60 people were engaged in gilding based on mercury amalgam technology. After all, none of them survived. That is, St. Isaac's is really a temple on blood, in fact. But the second church on blood is, so to speak, another blood.
На другой крови.
Другая кровь.
But this very phenomenon of Bolshevism, is it inherent in principle for the people, for civilization, or is it just some part of it that is a big carrier of this phenomenon? It can be added that we have looked into history just now. We are looking at how, time after time in Russia, we are trying to create this previous all-people state. Time after time a new elite arises, which leads to collapse. We again, as if from non-being, are reborn, and again we build an all-people state. Is there anywhere at all then in history where there are still such peoples and states that are trying to build precisely an all-people state, and not this rigid hierarchy?
Well, in general, in fact, the Americans also tried to build an all-people state. But they were crammed with a different culture, so they also fail to have an all-people state. But a simple American, he wants an all-people state. And sometimes he is convinced that he lives in an all-people state, where each person, if he wants, can make himself. But to make oneself means to become rich. And all-peopleness with us, it is understood in a slightly different way. And wealth here in general is not an end in itself. But the Americans, they are also for the all-people state. The system of channeling these aspirations, for them is different.
Can we say that Bolshevism is some kind of truly Russian subtlety?
Well, this is a civilizational component of our multinational regional civilization. Because, after all, if we analyze the epics of the peoples living on the territory within the borders of Russia,
в границах России, то
we will
мы
see
увидим,
that in the epics
что
there are very
этических
few ethical
различий
differences,
в эпосах очень мало. И благодаря
and
этому,
thanks to
в
this,
общем-то,
in general,
все межнациональные
all
конфликты
inter-ethnic
на
conflicts on the
территории
territory of
России
Russia,
в настоящем
in the
и в
present
прошлом,
and the past,
не дай
God
бог, в
forbid in the
будущем,
future,
они всегда
they have always been
искусственно
artificially made
делались
by the ruling
правящими
elites.
элитами. Вот Сталин
So,
характеризовал
Stalin characterized nationalism with the term petty bourgeois. In this respect, he was right,
он был прав. Потому что
because petty
мелочные
interests moved
интересы
all nationalists.
двигали всеми националистами. Крупные интересы, большие
Large
масштабные,
interests, big, large-scale, regional civilizational level or global civilizational interests do not fall into petty bourgeois thinking.
мелкобуржуазное мышление не укладывается. Каждый буржуй, он
Every
патриот
bourgeois,
своего
he is a
кошелька и
patriot of his
своего
wallet and nothing more.
То есть в этом отношении можно говорить о таком явлении.
That is, in this regard, we can talk about such a global view, it turns out.
Если не
Well,
очень
if not
мировой,
global,
мировой
then of
значимости.
global significance.
Потому
Because
что
if we talk about
если
global
говорить о
civilization,
глобальной
then
цивилизации, то
global
глобальная
civilization is
цивилизация
experiencing a
переживает
crisis.
кризис. Фактически она даже
In
втянулась
fact,
в коллапс.
it has even been drawn into a collapse.
Кризис от коллапса
A
отличается
crisis
тем,
differs
что
from a
из кризиса
collapse
можно выйти,
in that
не
it's
изменив
possible to
своего
egress
качества.
from a crisis without changing one's quality.
Проходил через целый
Well,
путь
that's how
кризиса.
capitalism went through a whole bunch of crises. It remained capitalism.
Да, там что-то
Yes,
менялось,
something
но
changed there, but quality, like the power of money and
и коммерческие
commercial orientation
ориентации, и
and commercial
коммерческие
criteria
оценки
for evaluating
деятельности,
any activity,
они доминировали
they dominated
сквозь
through a
череду
series of
кризисов.
crises.
А коллапс, он характеризуется тем,
A collapse is characterized by the fact that the internal dynamics of the collapse is a crumbling to zero.
Вопрос,
The question is, fast or slow?
из коллапса невозможно выйти, не
It is impossible
изменив
to
самого
egress from a
себя.
collapse without changing oneself. In order to egress from a collapse, it is necessary to change the quality.
В общем, мы опять возвращаемся к
И поэтому
Therefore,
мы
we return precisely to the fact that the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. Or the same meaning in the Quranic version, and there may spring from you a nation who invite to goodness and enjoin right conduct and forbid indecency. Such are they who are successful. That is, it is an orientation towards development, because dobro and evil are objectively different. Everything that works for development in its objective sense is dobro, and everything that works for degradation, no matter how sophisticated it is always evil. And, ignoring what Christ commanded in the first coming, civilization has come to what it has come to. Moreover, Christ allegorically warned about this. In the New Testament there are the words, "This is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and there shall no sign be given it, but the sign of Jonas the prophet." The prophet Jonah was sent by the Almighty to enreason the Assyrians, to the capital of Assyria, Nineveh. Well, in general, the comrade got cold feet and shied away from this mission. While sailing on a ship, Jonah was thrown overboard, sacrificed to the sea gods in order to calm the storm, and he was swallowed by a whale.
заглотил кит. Как сообщает
According to the Old Testament, he spent about 3 days in the whale's mouth.
примерно 3 дня. Понял
He understood the
перспективу,
prospects, turned to
обратился к
God,
Богу,
agreeing to
что
fulfill the
согласен
entrusted to him mission.
исполнить возложенную на него миссию. Кит доставил его
The whale
к
brought him to
берегу,
the shore, spat him out,
выплюнул,
and Jonah went out.
и Иона вышел. Но
This can be understood metaphorically.
это можно понимать метафорически. Иона
Jonah
это
is a
метафора
metaphor for man. The whale is a representative of the biosphere of the planet.
Соответственно,
Accordingly, the conflict of humanity with the biosphere of the planet,
глобальный
the global biospheric social ecological crisis, is a given. It is the result of the conflict of man, humanity, with the biosphere of the planet. Further, the choice. We continue to persist with self-concoction. The prospects should be clear. The biosphere is more powerful. The biosphere will protect itself from the crown of creation. Or we ponder on the reasons for what is happening, the prospects, develop an alternative that corresponds to the providence of the Most High, and realize this alternative with our own efforts, as Christ recommended 2,000 years ago.
собственными усилиями, как то рекомендовал Христос 2000 лет тому назад.